vanguard of modern terror, haven't you? One of the most terrifying precursors was Edgar Allan Poe, an American writer known for his tales and poetry of fantastic literature. Among his works, the most famous is the poem The Raven, and it is about it that we will speak now. First of all, let's know about Poe's life, right? Poe was an American writer from the 19th century and his life had many sad and troubled episodes. Poe was not so close to his family, he was an opium addicted, and Edgar Allan didn't have a very good status in literature while he was alive. The American was recognized worldwide after authors such as Baudelaire and Cortázar translated his works into French and Spanish. After a few years and several academic studies, it is possible to state that Edgar Allan Poe is one of the greatest writers in the West, an important person for literature and fantastic culture. The Raven was first published in 1845. The poem was so important in Poe's life, and after its publication, the American was beginning to be recognized in the world of literature. The works that bring a mysterious tone and a lot of musicality. It talks about a man who is falling asleep and suddenly he hears some noises on his door. At one of the times the man opens the door of his house to see if it was someone knocking it. A raven enters and lands on in a bust of Pallas. Thus, a dialogue between a bird and the subjects of Edgar Allan's works begins. One of the most curious things was that the American himself wrote an essay of this poem, now based on Edgar's essay called The Philosophy of Composition, where we will see an analysis of this work so famous and enigmatic.
Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. Only this, and nothing more.
At the beginning of the poem, it is already possible to realize the sound of the work, which is very important for The Raven. The author combines rhymes with a scheme of ABC, BBB, in addition to rhyming words in the same verse as dreary and weary, which each composes the musicality and permeates the whole poem. In addition, the choice of words denotes a melancholy lyric, and all of it is part of the eloquence. Midnight Dreary, which, according to the author in his essay, The Philosophy of Composition, he says he chose melancholy as tone for The Raven. According to him.
Regarding then beauty as my province, my next question referred to the tone of its highest manifestation, and all experience has shown that this tone is one of sadness. Beauty, of whatever kind, in its supreme development, invariably excites the sensitive souls to tears. Melancholy is thus the most legitimate of all the poetical tones.
Another choice that happens in sound is the repetition of the letter O. At the beginning of the poem, we see that the author chooses words such as door and more, because these words resonate the main words of the poem, Lenore and Nevermore.
Distinctly I remember it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow. Vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels named Lenore. Nameless here forevermore.
In the second stanza of the poem, the author presents us the beloved of the speaker, Lenore. Here, the melancholic effect begins to accentuate through to the space of cold and night and the love for Lenore. We can perceive a very important element in Poe's work, monomania. The passion and obsessed will of having Lenore makes the lyric itself has this mental condition. So, the nicest thing of it is that you realize it in other works as well, like Broinizi and the Black Cat. The desire to make the sound increasingly noticeable, Poe says in his essay that he also uses the repetition of the letter R, and so he chooses nevermore as the main word of the Raven.
The question now arose is to the character of the word. Having made up my mind to a refrain, the division of the poem into stanzas was of course a corollary, the refrain forming the close to each stanza. That such a close, to have force, must be sonorous and susceptible of protected emphasis, admitted no doubt, and these considerations inevitably lead me to the long O as the most sonorous vowel in connection with R as the most predictable consonant. The sound of the refrain being thus determined, it became necessary to select a word inbounding the sound, at the same time in the fullest possible keeping with the melancholy which I had predetermined as the tone of the poem. In such a search it would have been absolutely impossible to overlook the word nevermore. In fact, it was the very first which presented itself.
The rhyme brings to the poem a sonority that makes the Raven perfect for reading aloud and mainly at night because it creates a cold, frightening and dark atmosphere. In the Philosophy of Composition, an article written by Poe about this poem, he says the tone of the poem is sadness because for him the melancholia is the most authentic tone. The melancholia is what justifies the choice of the Raven as a central element. Poe thought of choosing a parrot because it is a repeating animal, but it didn't match the atmosphere of the poem. And as we can feel reading the poem, the Raven is just perfect. He represents the picture of death and its impact on the character, who deeply mourns and suffers the loss of his beloved Leonore, one of the central images as well.
But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing further then he uttered, not a feather then he fluttered. Still I scarcely more than muttered. Other friends have flown before. On the morrow will he leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, nevermore.
The raven perched on the bust of Pallas, another name for the Greek goddess Athena, known as a goddess of wisdom, can make a connection to the raven as a source of knowledge and insight, a prophetic bird that could represent someone who has the answers for the character questions, precisely the questions about his love and that Leonore. But also it can represent an old image. A rave depicted on the top of a skeleton seems exactly like the beast that occupy our nightmares, which makes total sense in a poem that a man are alone, in the dark, in his room or in his mind, if you prefer, with nothing but memories and thoughts to occupy, which creates a strong connection between the man, the raven, and the tone of the poem. The character starts talking to the bird, waiting for answers, but the only thing he receives is the word nevermore.
Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer swung by seraphim, whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee. By these angels he has sent thee respite and nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff this kind nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore.
The poem then follows in a crescent, where the character, desperate for the heavenly answers from that mysterious animal, begins to freak out. No matter what he asks, the answer is always the same and seems to make no sense, but the development of madness is also what brings the character close to the answer, because in the last stanza, the meaningless question he was waiting for was answered, which means he will see Eleanor nevermore.
And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the padded bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, and his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor, and my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore.
Poe says in the Philosophy of Composition that the choice of a love theme was because the loss of love of all themes is the most melancholic and poetic. It's important to remember that Poe was a romantic author and therefore carries features of this literary movement. The most striking in this poem is how the author builds what he calls the application variation effect. It is through the strong movement of questions to the raven, he varies the commonplace and to remove the character from his carelessness, but using a regular structure because the stanza ends always with nevermore, and because of that it builds an agonizing sensation in the reader. The reverberation of this poem surpassed the limits of the 19th and 20th century, where the poem influenced brilliant authors such as Machado de Assis, arriving in the 21st century with popular productions such as the teen series The Vampire Diaries, Simpsons, as well as many movies of Del Toro and authors of fantastic literature. Also, nowadays, his literature is much studied, and we can say that the poem The Raven is one of the chamber doors for this.